Have you ever felt like a book or a story was utterly and completely unique, and yet it still checked all the boxes of everything you usually want in a fantasy story? That's what I felt when I first read The Way of Kings, the first book in the Stormlight archive. This is Brandon Sanderson's magnum opus. With 4 books currently out of 10, the series is a behemoth of ambition and layers upon layers of details to pick up on. I would be lying if I said it isn't one of my favorite fantasy series, and I think in a few decades we will be talking about the Stormlight archive the same way we now talk about The Wheel of Time, Malazan Book of the Fallen, or maybe even Lord of the Rings. The Stormlight archive has never really struggled with popularity. Books and author have become so popular that there are even jokes among booktubers about how Stormlight dedicated videos always tend to do better than others. So because I'm a money-grabbing degenerate, I'm jumping on the bandwagon. What I want to talk about is something that I believe is often overlooked in the Stormlight archive. It's Eastern or Asian inspirations. Yes, part of the reason many readers find the Stormlight archive so fascinating and different from everything else in fantasy is because Brandon drew heavily from other cultures that we are perhaps not so familiar with. Of course, this will be a spoiler-filled video, so if you haven't read at least until Oathbringer, you may want to stop here. If you have, then just sit back, relax, and let's go. When I first read The Way of Kings, I was blown away by its depth. I was fully satisfied by the story on a surface level because the book does a great job at grabbing the attention of those readers who are simply looking for pure escapism and indulgence. But after putting the book aside for a while, I was left with this feeling that I had just started to scrape the surface. So let's dive deep, starting with what's on the surface. Perhaps the most obvious example of Eastern aesthetics in the Stormlight archive, at least to me when I first read it, was the hava, the traditional Vorin dress worn by female characters on Roshar. It's a design based on women attires from mixed cultures, but the Asian influences are quite obvious. Ben McSweeney, who draws Shallan's illustrations in the books, had this to say about the hava. The cheongsum, also known as the kipao, is a tight dress of Chinese Manchu origin. It was popular in the 1920s and 1930s among Chinese socialites and upper-class women in Shanghai. There are also influences from the Vietnamese hao dai, the Indian sari, and the Pakistanis sawal kameez. Male characters in the Stormlight archive wear the takama, which are essentially long and straight calf-length skirts. Kaladin sees one and is surprised by how much it looks like a woman's skirt. In current-day Roshar, the skirt is traditionally worn with a loose-fitting shirt and a cloth belt. This description in the text and even the name are very familiar to the Japanese traditional hakama. It used to be a required part of menswear, but nowadays hakamas are still used by practitioners of various martial arts. But there are more examples. Shallan's bridal dress was filled with red rubies, and Navani's crown had an intricate headdress of jade and turquoise, which is very similar to the Chinese fenghuan, a traditional type of headgear for women. It was worn mainly by noble women for ceremonies or official occasions. And jade and turquoise are also generally associated with luck in many Asian cultures. Brandon also admitted in a few interviews he did over the years that there is a clear inspiration in Asia. The character appearance is not clearly written in the books, though they look Chinese. In the same interview, he goes on to acknowledge just how much of an impact Asian culture had on him. But what about the actual looks of the characters? In his books, the Alethi are described as brown or dark-skinned, but in another interview in 2016, Brandon said he imagines the Alethi with a look that is hard to define. He says all of those born on Roshar, except for the Shin, have the epicanthic fold. He also said he uses half Asian and half Arab models in his guides. In another 2012 interview with the China Post, Brandon basically admitted that the Chinese numerology and the Confucian social order were strong influences in the series. He said, "In English, a 1 is a 1, but in Chinese, each number and character has multiple meanings. So the idea of numerology as a superstition and almost as a science was very fascinating to me." Interestingly enough, the number 4 in Bridge 4 wasn't chosen accidentally. In Chinese, the number 4 is a homophone of the word death, and there is a great superstition about avoiding this number. Say, avoiding the 4th floor of a building, for example, or Bridge 4 members who all end up dying in the bridge runs. No bridgeman wanted to be a part of the Bridge 4 at the start. When asked about the presence of Confucian social order in the books, he said, "The concept of the relationships between leaders and followers, fathers and children, were fascinating to me. It created a core order for a very organized culture." Confucianism started with Chinese philosopher and scholar Confucius. Confucius believed that to restore order, societies had to encourage certain values, such as loyalty, trustworthiness, and respecting your elders. He believed people were capable of attaining these and other virtues through education. By learning history, literature, and philosophy, people could gain insights. They could apply this knowledge to their private lives and to public political issues. Over time, his philosophy gained popularity in the political sphere and became the official belief system of the Chinese state. So what was this Confucian social order about? It was centered on relationships, mainly 5 key relationships. Fathers were above sons, husbands above wives, older siblings above younger ones, and rulers above their subjects. Friend-to-friend relationships were also unequal, since one side was always considered to have more power than the other. But the main idea of Confucianism is the importance of having a good moral character, which can then affect the world around this person through the idea of cosmic harmony. On Roshar, written language is done through glyph pairs, which are symbols heavily influenced by Chinese characters. Brandon's assistant Isaac said on Twitter that the Thalian and Alethi languages in the books are related in the same way that the Korean Hangul and Chinese are related. The best example of this is when Seth calls Nightblood Sword Nimi. In our world, there is the actual Korean honorific Nin, which is used for guests, customers, clients, and unfamiliar individuals, but also to someone who is revered and admired for having a significant amount of skill, intellect, and knowledge. But these are easier things to pinpoint. Some of them have been briefly mentioned on Reddit, so I want to go a little bit deeper than that. When I mention religion here, I'm not doing so from a Western, American, European point of view. In the West, Christianism is the most common religion, but in Asia, Hinduism, Buddhism, and even Taoism are more prevalent. In the Stormlight archive, there is the in-book religion, Warrenism, which is not too different from institutional religions themselves, so it's easy to draw parallels to the Catholic Church, for example. But as we continue to read the books, there are bits drawn from Buddhism and Taoism as well. In Hinduism and Buddhism, nirvana is the highest state that someone can attain, a state of enlightenment, meaning a person's individual desires and suffering go away. In these religions, one can achieve the state of nirvana by shedding their earthly desires and material possessions, by giving up anger, hatred, and vengeance. In Stormlight, all the characters who become radiants are people who struggled, who suffered, but who were eventually ready to forgive those who had harmed them, or at least put that behind them partially for the sake of a sort of greater good. In the books, by saying the ideals of the Knights Radiant, they acknowledge that there are bigger and better things than oneself. bigger and better than their own desires or material possessions. Those who fail to see that, like Moash, those who are blinded by their material needs and pains and struggles, their thirst for revenge and hatred, those start walking in the complete opposite path and become the furthest thing from a radiant. But to me, the entire process of becoming a radiant and somehow ascending to this quasi-godly status of power is maybe even more closely related to Taoism. Taoism is an ancient Chinese philosophy tradition that revolves solely around the concept of the Tao, or in English, the Way. Yes, the Way as in the Way of Kings. In Taoism, the Tao is the source, the pattern and substance of everything that exists. Taoist practitioners seek to be in perfect harmony with this invisible force. Taoism in itself deserves a whole video on it, but it emphasizes three concepts: compassion, frugality, and humility. And the key point here, though, is the Tao is also something that individuals can find immanent in themselves. The active expression of Tao is called De, which results from an individual living and cultivating the Tao. Keep the word cultivating in mind. We'll touch on that later. In traditional Chinese culture, the Qi is believed to be a vital force forming part of any living entity. It translates to air and material energy. Believers of Qi describe it as a vital force, the flow of which must be unimpeded for health. This isn't a far cry from Kaladin drawing Stormlight, something that is abundant on Roshar, in order to heal himself or gain strength or speed in combat. But in Chinese ancient culture, there is the concept of Qigong, the cultivation of this energy. It's a system of coordinated body posture and movement, breathing and meditation that is directly tied to martial arts but also to spirituality. The Qigong is claimed to provide a way to achieve spiritual enlightenment as well as a closer connection with the natural world. I can only think about the similarities between that and drawing Stormlight or bonding Spran in order to ascend to the status of Radiant. But I do think Brendan went even further into his embrace of Eastern concepts in the Stormlight archive. And that has to do with something I mentioned earlier, the concept of cultivation. The Chinese fantasy subgenre of xianxia fantasy, which explores this in detail, have become massively popular in China, but also in Korea, where Brandon used to live. In these novels and comics, the ultimate goal of cultivation is to become an immortal and attain godhood. Of course, in Stormlight, I don't think any of the Radiant characters are trying to become immortal, but becoming Radiance in itself is a step towards gaining supernatural powers or even attaining godhood, since they are clearly more powerful than those who cannot draw Stormlight. Cultivation itself isn't always a concrete goal of the characters in these stories. Rather, it's a means to an end, a style of thinking. I think this concept applies to Kaladin the most. Ever since he became a Radiant, he often struggles with what to do and is still riddled with depression, but he is working harder and attaining more and more power as the books go on, even taking squires. You could argue he is becoming a better cultivator and gradually attaining a level of godhood. Let's also not forget that cultivation literally makes a brief appearance in the Stormlight archive. In the Cosmere, cultivation is one of the 16 shards of Adelnasium and one of the 3 shards that are located on Roshar. This does not seem like a coincidence. Another thing that is very common in xianxia novels is the concept of cores. They belong to beasts and monsters. I enjoy reading the Korean comic Red Storm, where the protagonist, a cultivator, hunts these cores by killing monsters across the land. Of course, these monsters vary quite a bit depending on which novel or comic you're reading from, but it's common for them to have cores within their bodies that contain magical energy and essence. These cores are highly prized by cultivators since they can be sold for money, used for craft magical items, and consumed to boost the character's cultivation. This sounds awfully familiar to the entire concept of gem hearts of the Chasm Fiends, for example, which are hunted by both the Alethi and the Parshendi. The gem hearts are used for fabrials which are used to fuel everything in society. But just like the Xianxia cores can be consumed to boost their cultivation, characters in the Stormlight archive are also able to absorb the stormlight that is trapped inside the gemstones. I have a sneaky suspicion that Brandon must have watched a lot of anime or read these Xianxia novels in his time spent in Asia. You could even draw comparisons between Kaladin's plot arc in The Way of Kings and the Monkey King in The Journey to the West, with some aspects subverted. Journey to the West is a story about a semi-divine monkey who trains and powers up until he decides to overthrow heaven, and then he is tasked with serving as a bodyguard and proceeds to kick even more ass. In Kaladin's case, he trains and rallies Bridge Force, survives, bonds his Pren, and becomes radiant. Then he becomes Dalinar's bodyguard and fights Zeth. Both the Monkey King story and Stormlight Archive have one thing in common: crazy, earth-shattering battles that are over the top. I don't think it's a coincidence that a lot of people say they would prefer to see Stormlight adapted as a video game or an animated series instead of live-action movies. The Radiance ideals are also very clearly a mark of progress or stages of progression that each Radiant or Squire must go through in order to continue. In Xianxia novels, cultivating long enough lets the characters become demigods of some kind. The ties to martial arts are intrinsic, which in Stormlight that comes in the form with fighting with shard blades, which are essentially swords. This is interesting because in Asian history and culture, the most famous swordsmen we recognize in the West are samurai. They wore hakanas, they were Asian, and they used sword forms called kata, the exact same word Brandon uses to describe when Adolin practices with a shard blade, for example. But besides fighting with swords, samurai were perhaps best known for their extremely strict code of honor. Yes, honor. Now I want to say that while Brandon Sanderson has clear inspirations drawn from different and multiple Asian cultures, I don't think this influence extends into cultural appropriation. It's clear to anyone who reads the Stormlight Archive that Brandon draws from many places, cultures, religions, including his own. So to me, it seems normal that he drew some inspiration from Eastern culture and philosophies since he spent some time in South Korea. But it's probably worth mentioning that Xianxia and Wuxia novels and comics weren't as popular in the West or even readily available back in 2010 when The Way of Kings was published. Even less so in 2002 when Brandon started working on the series. You could barely find any Asian-inspired fantasy in the bookshelves in the West. There was tremendous prejudice against these books, and Asian authors in general were told that Asian-inspired stories did not sell. So even though it's no longer the case, you could argue that Brandon might have benefited from the Asian influence in his work in a period while other minority authors were barred from publication. So I hope I did enough to show you just how much Brandon has drawn from Eastern culture in the Stormlight Archive. I'm sure there is more that I missed, so if that is the case, comment down below and let me know about it. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. If you liked this video and you'd like to see more of this content, feel free to subscribe to the channel and leave a like down below. This is Chill Deep Dives, and see you next time.